Welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking about vendor management. I am going to give you all the best tips and tricks so that you know how to do it well. This was actually requested by a viewer who wanted a deep dive into vendor management. So today we're going to talk about how to get started, how to do a good vendor selection, how to actually manage the vendor once it's in place, and then also some red flags to look out for with vendors and some best practices for you. First, when you're getting started, it is important to understand what your role is in the company when it comes to managing this vendor. For example, in many companies, they actually have a procurement department whose job it is to facilitate some of the logistical steps with the vendor, and they usually have a heavy role in vendor selection. So it's important to know how you interact with other teams at your company when it comes to managing this vendor. Especially if you're new to this, you may not be aware of all the different players. So be sure to work with whoever has asked you to get involved with this vendor to make sure you know who are the other parties that I need to work with in my own company and what is my specific role in managing this vendor. You may be responsible for the day-to-day interactions with the vendor and the day-to-day management of the vendor, especially if this is your first time. However, you may have been hired into a more senior role, but it's still your first time working with a very structured vendor, so you may be the executive escalation point and someone else is doing the day-to-day management. Just make sure you know who all the players are and make sure that you have the internal structure really solidified in your own head before you start working with the vendor so as not to cause confusion for yourself, other teams internally, and for the vendor. If you are responsible for the day-to-day management of the vendor and somebody else is the internal executive escalation, make sure that you sit down with them and work out some working agreements with that executive escalation so that you guys are on the same page about what you're doing versus what they're doing. If you are neither the executive escalation nor the day-to-day manager of the vendor, but you are heavily involved with the vendor as a SME, there are certain parts of this video that will still be helpful to you, so keep watching. I think it goes without saying, but if you are a small business owner or a freelancer and you're working with a vendor partner, then everything I'm describing is on you. You're wearing all these different hats unless you have established a hierarchy underneath yourself, in which case you still need to know what all the different hats do. So all of this is going to be pertinent to you. So let's start with the vendor selection process. First, make sure that you know what your vetting process is and what your selection criteria is. If this is being run by an internal procurement department, they'll usually have a template, so make sure that you request any templates that your company already has in place for doing vendor selection. You will also need to make sure that if you are the business sponsor or you're working with the business sponsor, that you sit down and write down what the selection criteria is with that business sponsor. So you need to know what you're measuring them on. There's a certain standard things that all vendors are measured on, and that's what's going to be provided by your procurement department, but the things that are specific to what you need as the business stakeholder or the representative of the business stakeholder, those are the things that you need to actually write down and document. For example, if you're looking for a software vendor, there's going to be certain protocols that that vendor follows that the procurement department is going to be looking for. But if you are representing the business in some way, then you need to be looking for the features that the software provides and make sure that you've got a clear understanding of that. This is the precursor to requirements, but they're at a higher level. And so what you're going to want to do is create a matrix of how you're going to score the vendors and what you're going to score them on. And you want to have this ahead of time. You can feel free to share it with the vendor depending again on if your procurement department's okay with it. If you don't have a procurement department, you can Google common selection criteria for vendors or templates for vendor selection. There's tons of information out there about what it is that you need to look for from kind of that base is the vendor functional perspective. Now, depending on the size and scale of your business, this is going to be more or less rigorous. For example, if you're just a small company and you're looking for a pretty small contract, you need to look for certain things that are different than if you are a very, very large enterprise company, you are in a regulated industry, that changes everything, and that's where procurement is especially important. Or if you are working with a really large vendor and you're trying to select between some of the big guys out there, that is going to be more or less rigorous. But if you don't have an internal procurement department to guide you through that piece of it, make sure that you're doing your Googling. Feel free to ask ChatGPT and do a lot of research on your own side about what goes into that. If there's an interest in having me provide more information about the vendor selection criteria, please let me know and I can do another video on it, or I can whip up a worksheet and make a link for it. So just let me know if you guys want some resources on that specifically. Once you have your selection and vetting criteria documented, make sure that you understand, again, your internal roles and hierarchy before you start reaching out to vendors. And then once you / your company are reaching out to these vendors, make sure that you understand the roles of everybody at the different companies. I highly recommend making a document or a spreadsheet where you keep track of all the different players for each of the different companies that you're looking at when you're working with vendors. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of time during the sales cycle, vendors will often switch out SMEs and switch in and out tons of different people. So even if you're initially working with 2 to 3 people, they will often be bringing in and rotating in and out 12, sometimes up to 20 people, and you need to understand what their roles are and if you're going to be seeing them again. Because I've gone through this where I've gotten attached to a certain sales team and they've made changes mid-cycle, and frankly, that's really disrupted the process and also disrupted the relationship. Part of what you're doing during the vendor selection process is establishing relationships with the different vendor resources and making sure that they're really the kind of people you can work with. Are they a cultural fit? Are they a personality fit? You want to make sure this is going to be a long relationship that you can work with these people. Now, if the vendor you're working with is particularly large, the sales team is most likely not going to be the implementation team. Sometimes you'll have continuity between the sales executive and the implementation team. Very often, that is the only area of continuity, and you will get entirely different people. So make sure that you also ask questions about that during this vendor selection process of the people that you're working with and you're connecting with during the sales process, how many of them are going to carry over into implementation. Now, if you do get particularly attached to a SME or a certain resource, you as the client can actually ask that they be part of the implementation team. Most companies will make an effort to do that. I do have to be realistic and say that also depends on the dollar amount of the contract. You obviously have more pull with the vendor the higher the dollar amount is, or the potential value of the relationship. So you may be engaging in a small contract up front, but if they're aware that you have more opportunities to work with them and grow the relationship, they're also then more likely to invest more in the relationship itself. That's just a reality. Of course, they're interested in money, so the more money that you either have on the table or in future tables, potentially, the more likely they are to accommodate requests like that. So one thing I do want to note about vendor management is that sometimes you're on both sides of the table. Sometimes you're the client, sometimes you're the vendor, sometimes you're both at the same time. So I've got about 20 plus years in vendor management being on both sides of the table. I've been the client, I've been a leader with the client, I've been an executive stakeholder as the client, vetting vendors, selecting vendors, managing vendors, and making decisions about the longevity of their contracts. I've also been on the vendor side as a consultant where I've been the account leader or a practice leader or an engagement leader managing the relationship and the delivery as well as the sales cycle. So I've got a lot of experience on both sides of this. So everything I'm saying in this video is weighted with that experience of the best practices on both sides of the table. So as a vendor, knowing what the client needs to be doing to set up that relationship for success, and then also being on the client side, knowing sometimes what the hard decisions are and how to keep from going astray. One of the best things that you can do as part of this sales process is make sure that you and your company are creating a lot of documentation about the vendor selection process. You also want to make sure that the vendor themselves is producing and giving you a lot of documentation as well. If they can't document anything during the sales cycle, A, it gets a lot harder to hold them accountable during implementation. B, it makes it a lot harder to measure them during the sales process itself. And C, that kind of gives you an indication that they may not have the maturity and the rigor that you need going forward and for long term. The documentation that you create makes sure that internally you guys are tracking the information and the decisions that you're making as part of the vendor selection process, and that helps make sure that you make really solid internal decisions during this vendor selection process, that you're not getting swayed too much by emotions. The relationship is really important, but you also need to make sure that the substance is there. So as you're going through this process, build those relationships and make sure that these are the kind of people you want to work with, but also make sure that doesn't overshadow the substance that they bring to the table. And your ability to document and just look back on that documentation will help you confidently make decisions both through the relationship and through the functional aspect of this process. It also, frankly, provides a lot of CYA. So if you are working with a procurement department, they have a lot of rigor in place, and that is in place to protect your company. So anything your procurement asks you to do, even if they seem fussy about it, and sometimes procurement people can be a little bit cranky to work with, but just understand that their entire goal is to protect your company financially and legally, and they take that responsibility very, very seriously. So it can be easy to interpret some of the stuff procurement does as either annoying or frustrating or as a barrier, but I promise you these procurement departments are in place for a reason, and the things they do will protect you and your company, especially if you have less experience with this. They do know some of the things that can happen that might sound a little far-fetched if you haven't done this a lot, but things can get nasty pretty quickly with a vendor or a potential vendor. So the documentation that you create either with procurement or on your own is super important to protect your company. I'm just going to kind of compare it to doing an interview when you're hiring. The reason HR wants you to document certain things is because they want to make sure that this is a defensible position, that any decisions that you make when you're hiring people, that it's justified and that nobody can sue you for kind of unfair practices. It's the same thing with a vendor. You may not have ever been in a sticky situation with a vendor, but there's two things to want to avoid. One is if you're going through a very regimented procurement process, especially if you work for a regulated entity, healthcare, utilities, pharmaceuticals, things like that, the scrutiny on the decisions you make are incredibly important. It's even more important in public sector because there's so much rigor around state and federal funding and how you select vendors. This is a very, very regimented process. And if you don't work for a regulated entity or you're not in the public sector, you might tend to think, well, this is a little bit more casual. It's actually not. There's just risks in a different way, if that makes any sense. So what you want to make sure that you're doing is making sound decisions that you can justify and that stand up to external scrutiny. And so make sure that there's no room for accusations of favoritism or unfair behavior. An unfair behavior would be during the selection process providing information to one vendor that you did not provide to another vendor. So make sure that any information that you're providing to any of the vendors you're working with, you can demonstrate. This is why you want to do a lot of things in writing. You want to demonstrate that you have shared that information with all of the vendors equally so they all have an equal opportunity to respond fairly with information that they've all received. You also don't want to talk to vendors about other potential vendors to the extent that don't even tell them who you're talking to most of the time. Now, there's some cases where I've been on the consulting side and the client has shared with us that they're working with another specific consulting company. That mostly happens if that consulting company is already in-house with them. A lot of times they'll let us know that because that also lets us know that that vendor has access to a lot more information than we do because they're already there. So when you're on the client side, however, make sure that you keep your nose clean, that you know which information you can share with the vendors that you're talking to, and that you do share it equally, and that you don't give an unfair competitive advantage by telling one vendor about another vendor. That's kind of a no-no. So if you have any questions about that, make sure that you are consulting with, again, your procurement department, your legal department, or if you don't have access to that, at least ask your boss and get the answer in writing because you really want to keep your nose clean. The other potential liability you're opening up without doing enough documentation is going into implementation. A lot of clients feel like the promises vendors make get lost between sales and implementation. So you want to make sure everything's documented. It's really easy to, especially because salespeople are good. That's why they're salespeople, and they're really good at building relationships. And they will give you a lot of verbal reassurances and a lot of verbal promises. But if those aren't documented, and especially if they don't make it into the contract, which we'll talk about in a second, they're not real. They're not. They might reassure you verbally that you'll have access to a certain resource. Oh, he's not going to be assigned on your project, but he'll be behind the scenes and you can have access to him. 99% of the time, you'll never see that guy again. Or they'll promise that the software does something, but if it's not documented that the software does that thing, it probably doesn't do that thing. Or they might like for it to do that thing, and that feature may or may not be available in 2 years, right? But if it's not in the documentation about the software, it's vaporware. So again, the documentation helps you make better decisions, make justifiable decisions if they come under external scrutiny, and also make sure that everything that you're discussing during the sales cycle is then something that the vendor is providing during implementation. So document, document, document. I once had a client say, and I love this about her, she always used to tell the team she worked with that she wins on documentation, and she does. So be that winner as well. The other thing you want to check during the sales cycle is going to sound a little bit nebulous, but take this to heart. It's vibes and work style. So work style encompasses a lot of different things, right? Work style can be sense of urgency, it can be communication style, it's a lot of different things. And make sure that this compatible work style is more than just one person. So if you're working with a large sales team and you're really vibing with the account executive or the sales executive, but you don't have those same vibes with anybody else on the team, that might tell you something about their culture and that company's work style. Sometimes it's not just an individual work style. So if you're not gelling with the more of the sales team than just one person, that's something to look out for. When you're doing vendor selection, you need to make sure that the vendor meets all of your criteria from a business and a functional perspective, and that you're double checking that through your documentation. And you also just need to make sure that, yes, that relationship is progressing and that you've got a good working relationship, but you also need to make sure that you guys are going to work similarly during the project, that they take statusing seriously, that they take all the different things we're going to talk about when it comes to governance, that they are comfortable and familiar with that. They're used to working that way. What you don't want to do is, I've seen some companies where they're highly structured and they expect a certain level of communication, and they'll bring in smaller or less mature vendors who are not used to that much rigor and that much structure, and the vendor fights against it the whole time and doesn't understand how to operate in that structure. So compatible work style is really important. Another thing to watch out for is if you have a work style where you have a very high sense of urgency and this vendor is super laid back and chill about things, those aren't going to mesh well. And even if you can get through the sales cycle without friction on that, that will come up as a constant friction point during implementation. Doesn't mean one's right and the other's wrong, it's just a compatibility thing. Similar to work style, communication style is also important. Are you all equally comfortable communicating via email, or do you like to have phone calls for certain kinds of things, or do you hate meetings and you prefer things to be in writing? Just figure out that communication style. Also, you're going to have to make sure that the vendor is responsive during this sales cycle, because vendors who don't respond during this sales cycle, they're going to be even worse during the implementation cycle. So just remember that during the sales cycle, everybody's on their best behavior for the most part. So if their best behavior isn't up to your standards, it will only get worse. It's just like if you're looking to marry somebody, their behavior won't improve after marriage. It will actually degrade a little bit. It's the same thing with a vendor. So just make sure that they are meeting or exceeding your standards for communication during the sales cycle, because again, usually they're not going to be as good at communicating during implementation. Something to watch out for. Also, make sure that they're asking you questions during the sales cycle. If they're not asking you questions, then they're actually more interested in selling than in delivering. So even though questions can be super annoying because you as the client are like, well, I've provided them with all this information. If they're not seeking to truly understand what you want done and why you're doing it, that means that they're going to have a lot of issues during delivery, and especially in the first part of delivery where they're trying to understand your requirements. And they also may not be able to do the thing that you're trying to do. They don't actually know that if they're not asking you a lot of questions. So be patient with questions during the sales cycle, but also be watchful if they're not asking enough of them, because that means that they're just trying to sell to you and they're not worried about how they're actually going to deliver it. Also, when it comes to that culture check I talked about, one of the things to look out for is collaboration. If you expect a highly collaborative relationship, or if you work in a highly collaborative environment, kind of ask yourself, what level of collaboration am I looking for? And make sure that they are on that same page. There are different cultural styles in different companies. Even if you look at some of the big consulting companies, some of them are more hands-on, more relationship-y, and more problem-solving, and others tend to do more cookie cutter, have more formal relationships, and they kind of tend to just go off and solve things on their own and are frankly a little bit less collaborative. And that works for some companies. So make sure that as you go through this process, you have some self-awareness about your own expectations of collaboration, how much you want to collaborate and how formal you want to interact, and make sure that you and the vendor are on the same page about that. Now, even if it's not an organic cultural fit, as long as it's like close, you can work with that. But if you guys are on opposite ends of the spectrum with that, that's not going to change. Like, you're not going to be able to fix that. It's like dating somebody who you want to text them 15 times a day and they want to talk to you like on the phone once a week and not communicate outside of that. It's not gonna work. One of my final points is something that you wanna do at the beginning of the sales cycle and continue, which is openly discussing and managing expectations. So up front, when you engage with a vendor, at that time, talk about expectations. I wanna do a check-in weekly during the sales cycle. Let's have 3 meetings a week where we can answer questions and ask questions of each other. Or, hey, we do our status reports on Friday, so even though we're in the sales selection process, I need an update from you guys every Thursday. This is also a good time to talk about those communication style things I mentioned. And so up front during the sales process, when you're doing vendor selection, make sure that you guys are on the same page about what that selection process looks like and how you want to navigate it together. Also, if there's certain things you can or cannot share with them, make sure to establish that up front so that they know how to work with you. And then one of the biggest things to look out for during this vendor selection phase is how well they keep their commitments. Just like communication, they're going to be a little extra during the sales cycle when it comes to keeping commitments. So if they're struggling to keep commitments during the sales process, that does not bode well for how they're going to work with you during implementation, or if it's software where you need to have a longer relationship with them than just implementation. That's incredibly important during the vendor selection phase, because again, if they can't keep their commitments when they're trying to sell, they certainly will struggle to keep their commitments during implementation, and then even more so during maintenance. So keep an eye on how well they keep their commitments. You don't have to be like a big dragon about it. If they say it's Thursday and it's Friday and that doesn't actually impact you, okay, like maybe mention it, but I wouldn't like be a big bear about it. But if you set like a hard deadline for something and they consistently miss it and it does impact you, you're going to have to let them know that that's going to impact your perception of them during the sales process. And you can give them feedback about it and you can fuss at them, but in my mind, what's the point? Just frankly take that as a data point and definitely downgrade their rating based off of that, because that's going to be a problem going forward. All right, now you have selected your vendor. Let's talk about engaging and managing that vendor. And I want you to keep in mind that 70% of your success during this engagement with this vendor is going to be based on your preparation. So what you do coming out of vendor selection and moving into setup and prep is going to absolutely drive the success of this engagement that you're doing with this vendor. So don't skimp here. So first, keep in mind that you are going to have a huge team transition, again, from the sales team to the engagement team. And no matter what criteria you put on this vendor about make sure that you have a strong sales handoff to the build team, if they have not started to get that build team involved towards the tail end of that sales process, you should expect that there's going to be a knowledge gap and that you need to help fill that knowledge gap. That's not ideal. It's frustrating. You're paying these people, but you want this engagement to be successful. So make sure that you are available and prepared to spend time with this new team, making sure they understand what you're trying to get done. Because if you do not spend this time with the build team, I guarantee they will start off wrong and you will have a correction in the project at the midpoint. So again, make sure that up front you allocate enough of your own time and your internal team's time to helping this team get set up for success. Otherwise, you're going to have issues down the line and it's going to cost you more time and money than if you did it up front. As you move into the engage phase and you're coming out of the vendor selection phase, this is where contracting becomes incredibly important. So I just want you to keep in mind, contract is clarity. Okay, so you don't want to be the kind of client who like beats up the vendor with the contract all the time, but you also don't want to be the kind of client, and this is something I've seen on the consulting side quite a bit, is we'll walk into an engagement with an incredibly vague contract and then people flail and struggle because they don't have the clarity they need on the project expectations with the client. And there's often huge information and knowledge gaps between the sales team handoff and the implementation handoff. And frankly, a lot of times the salespeople didn't even ask those questions. So what you, the client, can do is make sure that every single thing you know and expect and thought you were getting is in that contract. You are not doing this to be a jerk, and you don't have to feel bad about it, because what you're doing is you are genuinely investing in the mutual success between you and this vendor that you're working with. So the more that you can put into this contract, the better. That can be complicated, and again, it can take a lot of upfront time, but you aren't paying the vendor yet when you're in the contracting phase. So what you don't want to be doing is providing this clarity 3 months later with a team that you are paying for. So one thing to keep in mind is that every person that the vendor onboards for that project phase, the implementation phase, and then for any potential maintenance phases, every single one of those people is going to read that contract and be looking for what it is they're on the hook for delivering. They'll be looking not only for what to deliver, but also any decisions y'all have made about how they need to do it. So any expectations you have around statusing, format, documentation, executive steering committees, governance, escalation processes, roles and responsibilities, make sure all of that is in the contract. And again, this is not you being a jerk. This is you making sure that you and your company have equal clarity with the vendor and all of their resources on what and how they're supposed to be doing. This is also important if you have received any promises from the sales team, again, about resources. Like, we'll make sure we have a resource who knows JavaScript. Make sure that there's a JavaScript person in the contract. You want the contract to be as detailed as possible. You can even go so far as to put a RACI in the contract itself, and then also a resource plan and a schedule in there. So that can sound like a lot, but again, that's time you're investing to make sure that you've got clarity in the contract. And if you don't do it in the contract, when you are not paying for vendor resources, you will be doing that over and over again with the vendor team, I promise you, when you are paying them. So two of the biggest time sucks I've seen on projects that do cost the client money is usually confusion around resources, confusion about how to work together, like what the expectations are about how to work, and then also confusion about what the project is supposed to be delivering at the end. So you want to make sure that that is all documented as clearly as possible, because again, it's going to cost you significant time and money if it's not. And you may think, no, they were great. Or even in the first 3 months of the project, Gabby, the first 3 months are going great. You were crazy. No, wait till month 6, wait till month 9. Shit is gonna blow up if you do not have this locked down in the contract, I promise you. Now, if you're in a different situation where you are responsible for managing this vendor and you were not part of the vendor selection or the contracting phase, or if you were just tangentially part of the selection process, not driving it, then you're in the same boat. You wanna make sure you can read that contract and understand what's in it. And if the project is pre-kickoff, at kickoff, or closely after kickoff, and you've received this project and you're reading this contract and you're like, it has none of this information, that is absolutely something where you need to call a timeout and sit down and make sure that you quickly get that information nailed down in writing, and that you, whoever's at your company that did that, and then whoever's with the vendor are all on the same page. So that's one of my biggest lessons learned in my professional career, is call a timeout when you need it, and you might need it earlier than other people think. Meaning, if you're looking at this and you're like, there's huge risks because there's all this unknown stuff, then call a timeout, take a pause, and make sure that you have as much clarity as possible before moving forward. Because again, if you guys aren't providing that clarity to the vendor and they do 3 months of development and that 3 months is wrong, you're on the hook for that. You, the company, will be paying for rework. So either in the contract or immediately after the contract, you want to make sure you formalize the structure. And formalizing the structure is two things. It's making sure that you've got your hierarchy and structure for implementation on the client side, and that you have the vendor document their hierarchy and structure on the vendor side. And then what you want to do is make sure that you know who's matching up with who. So if you're the day-to-day contact, who is the day-to-day contact on the vendor side? If you have your boss as an escalation, who's the escalation on their side? You want a name and a role. And again, as much as possible, this should be in the contract. I've seen a lot of people not do it in the contract. So if it's not, make sure that you do it immediately afterwards. And what we normally do on both the client and the vendor side is we make a slide, and we literally make like a little tree of both org structures of the people who are actually involved. And then you want to draw lines between the people who connect with each other. That can sound very, very formal and rigorous, but it is so helpful for people to know who other people are. And then what we always do is we also put that in the kickoff deck. And then what you want to do is also have a box that has all of the additional resources and additional SMEs. They may not be assigned to the project, but they're people who people may need to reach out to for information. Have them in the box, and then also include them in the kickoff so that they're aware of the project and they're aware of their role in the project. As you're creating this structure, make sure that everybody in the structure is aware of their role in the structure and that they need to be spending time on this effort. A lot of times and I'm going to say this from the consulting side, we'll work with clients and they'll give us a list of 10 people. Those 10 people have no idea that they're supposed to be working with us. They're constantly shocked and they don't have time allocated for it. That's another thing that can cost you time and frankly money in a project, is if your internal resources do not have the bandwidth to support the project, that's a problem. So you want to know that as early as possible. Frankly, you want to go through whatever internal process you have to do to request their time and attention, and also make sure that they're included as early as possible so that they know what's coming and that you're not having to go back and educate them while your vendor's building something. You're educating your own team. You don't want to be doing that. So include people along the way as much as possible. Formalize the structure. Make sure everybody in that structure knows what their roles and the expectations on them are, and then make sure that's in the kickoff and that they're included in the kickoff. What you don't want to do is kick off with like 5 core people, but 25 people need to support the project and they don't know about it. Also, once the project is working on kickoff and kicking off, make sure that in your own mind, you've allocated time for onboarding and setup of this new team and this new project. Every client says, we want you guys to hit the ground running, right? That's awesome. But there are certain amounts of ramp up and prep that are required, even if the delivery team was involved in the sales cycle. Like, no matter how perfect you make it, there's going to be some time for onboarding and setup. And depending on how rigorous your company is, a lot of time, that time is actually introduced and then blocked by your own company. So getting accounts set up, getting Jira set up, whatever tools y'all are using for the project, there's a certain amount of time that takes. That's just reality. So make sure that you and the vendor are on the same page about that and that you know how long it takes. A lot of times you might call that like a sprint 0 for setup and getting to know each other, or you might build in time for like a smaller amount of the vendor's team to start to do that setup, and then the rest of the team joins. But you should know that with the vendor during the selection process and during the contracting process, because that should be part of the overall schedule. Really, what I want to reinforce though is that you mentally and emotionally prepare for that, because I am going to say that on the client side, it can be pretty frustrating. You need to rehash a bunch of stuff. You've gone through this big selection process, you've gone through contracting, you're ready to get started, and it feels like you guys are taking a step backwards. Just keep in mind that unless you can do advanced onboarding into your systems, which most people can't, and unless it's exactly the same people, there's going to be transition time, there's going to be onboarding time. And make sure that you give your time to that as well, because you need to let them know how to work with your company. And you need to spend your time supporting this new team so that they can be successful, which means giving them insights into the company, telling them things 3 or 4 times. I am famous for not liking to repeat myself, but I have had to learn, as frustrating as it is, that when you're working with a new team, they are human, they're people, they need to hear things 3 or 4 times. Sometimes they need to hear it 3 or 4 different ways. So you might say something and they might interpret it differently. So make sure that as you're saying things 3 or 4 times, that you are saying it a few different ways so that they can really get what you're trying to say. And just remember, they are there to help. They do want to help. Definitely be prepared to do your part to help them help you. And not only should you be setting aside that time for yourself, make sure that other required people have set aside the time. So we did talk about how in the kickoff and in that structure, everybody in the structure needs to know how much time and that you can go request their time that they need to spend. And also make sure that during the startup period, the more key resources on your side are going to have a heavier demand on their time. And they may not know that. And they may think, oh, but my time will start in 3 weeks once they're really going. But no, they need to spend time during the onboarding phase as well. Plan for that and make sure that they're prepared for that. And then also just spend time with them getting them ready. So yes, it takes a lot of time to do an engagement. I think that a lot of clients underestimate the amount of time it takes to work with a vendor, to manage the vendor, and to give them the information they need to be successful. But if you invest that time up front into all of this prep we're talking about, and into building the relationship, and then into getting them on board and set up correctly and giving them the information they need to be successful, again, that's that 70% I was talking about that is going to help ensure your success. The rest is on them. If they suck, they suck, right? But even the best vendor, even the best consulting company will not be successful if you don't do all the things I just said. So most of what I just talked about was prep. Now I'm going to talk about the actual setup. Yes, this is very detailed. So again, feel free to skip around in parts of the video that resonate more or less with what you're looking for with how to manage a vendor. But this next part is incredibly important, which is setting up the actual management structure. We talked about the people structure, like the relationships and the hierarchy and the roles. Now let's talk about the mechanics. So right away, you need to get your governance structure set up. You want to set up your governance structure while things are good before they get hairy. That is going to be so helpful because when things start to go sideways, people aren't trying to figure out who to talk to or how to escalate or where to go or meeting certain executives for the first time. You want those relationships to already exist, and you want people to know just by second nature what to do if something goes wrong. That is what a governance structure is and what it's for. So right away from the beginning, make sure that you have in place your escalation paths and your checkpoints. Make the vendor schedule it, or you can schedule it if you want to, but push as much onto the vendor as you can for scheduling. But make sure that your status meetings are set up, that your executive steering committee meetings are set up, that you guys have an agreed upon template for status reports, that you have an agreed upon template for executive status meetings. If you have in-house templates that you guys use, share them with the vendor and ask that they use them, because that will make life easy for your executives. If your company is less structured and rigorous in that way, then have the vendor supply that, because they have their own templates and documents as well that they use. And if they don't, again, that's a red flag. So watch out for that. But most legitimate companies who do delivery do have their own templates that they use, so you can use theirs if you don't have your own. If you need to use yours and the vendor pushes back on that, definitely explain to the vendor that when it comes to executive steering committee or statusing, usually if you have templates and formats that you have to use, it's because you guys are of a certain size. So make sure they understand this is how to successfully communicate with your executive team. And if they try and communicate in a different way, the executive team will not participate in that conversation. That sounds harsh, but that is actually what happens. That is actually the truth. So make sure that you communicate that to that vendor, that you understand that they have their own ways of working and their own documentation, but for these specific meetings, you have to use your internal templates or else the executive team won't listen. That's actually a really big deal in some companies. So know where your company is with that and what you can flex on and what you can't. It can be human nature to want to be super flexible sometimes, but don't be so flexible that you actually hurt yourself or your company or the vendor's ability to be successful. Because I do see a lot of that happening with a lot of project sponsors and day-to-day people, is they're trying so hard to be nice that they don't give the vendor clear guidance. And they're trying so hard to be flexible that they're not telling the vendor what straight up does and doesn't work at their company. So again, this is where we said the contract is clarity, and now we're going to say clarity is kindness, because if you're being super clear about what works in your company, that is the kindest thing you can do to help the vendor know how to work with your company. So again, up front, get your governance structure set up. That also means that you need to have a risk log in place and that you guys are having these really good conversations in your status meetings. So when we say set up the governance structure, it is the meetings and the documentation and the formats of all of the reports and information that need to be presented and discussed. Make sure that your key stakeholders are in these meetings, and use your leadership team within your own company to get buy-in to ensure that these people attend these meetings, because they're very important. And at first it's all exciting and rah-rah and, you know, we're getting this set up and that set up. That's great. That's good. What that's doing is setting up a foundation of success. So again, when things are hard, there's trust. And so the more rigor and the more exposure you guys have up front, the more trust there is when things get harder down the line. It can also be very easy as the project sponsor or as the client person managing the vendor to want to hide things that are bad early on. Like if something's taking an extra week, if something's doing this. I would say that's not helpful. Like, you're not doing your company any favors if you're doing that. Now, if you're working for a company where the culture is very attacky and blamey, I get it, right? But make sure you frame things positively. Like, we took an extra week, that this is what's going to happen and that's going to be okay. But you have to be upfront. Don't hide things and make sure that you're just factual about it, but that you say things in a positive way. But if things are starting off wrong like that, you know, that's great that you want to give the vendor a pass on it. And again, you don't need to be a big jerk about it, but slipping early pushes everything down the line, and they may have some buffer in their contract. You don't want to eat up all of the buffer in the first month. And I do see that happen a lot. Getting started is the hardest part of any engagement, to start off strong and well. And so make sure that you and the vendor have a really good plan right off the bat to start off strong. And one of the first things is getting this governance set up, because then the visibility is there from the beginning. The transparency is there from the beginning. The communication lines are open from the beginning. And again, do your part in giving them the information they need on how to show up to these meetings. Also, outside of the formal governance meetings, make sure that you have leadership meetings set up with the vendor. So make sure that you have a one-on-one setup with your peer at the vendor, the person who is working with you day to day. Make sure that you have those check-ins set up. And then however much structure you have in your project team, make sure that those other leaders are also having check-ins. So one of the best paths to success I see on any engagement is when there is direct communication between the client and the account lead on the vendor side, between the architect on the client side and on the vendor side. So the QA people, so the project managers, so whatever structure you guys have, make sure each of those connection points have regular one-on-ones as well, where they can ideate, where they build trust, where they're collaborating. This is a lot of where the collaboration comes in, is it's not just in the team meetings, it's in these one-on-one meetings as well. And that again builds the relationship, because having that relationship and understanding each other's communication is what's going to make sure that the stuff that happens during the project goes super, super smoothly. So set up your formal governance structure, and then also set up your informal check-ins with each other to relationship build, to ideate, all things like that. Now, one thing to be cautious of is if you end up making decisions in the one-on-ones more than you are in the governance meetings, that's not a problem as long as you cascade them effectively. It's actually really good to have that kind of relationship where you guys are problem solving together, but what you want to make sure is that those decisions don't just stay in that meeting and that they're only verbal. So if you guys are making decisions in your one-on-ones at any level, this is you, yourself, and also your team, make sure that people are then sharing that information immediately and also documenting that information. Keep that as part of your decision log. Make sure that people are updating that. Make sure that people are updating the Slack channel. So if you're in there with your account person and they're not updating their team, the information dies with them. Same thing with you. So just make sure that you guys have the proper communication cascade. The other thing you need to make sure to do is participate in all of the appropriate project meetings. Definitely go to the project kickoff. And I say appropriate because there's some meetings where it just doesn't make sense for you to be in. If you're a director or above at the client and they have a lot of junior resources doing the build activities, you do not need to go to all of their sprint ceremonies. That is something you guys need to be negotiating. So make sure that you're appropriately involved, which is you're not micromanaging them, you're not project managing them. They should have their own project manager. So you're involved at the level you should be involved in, and make sure that that's a negotiation between you and their account leader on, hey, what meetings do you guys need me in? Where does it make sense for me to plug in? And where does it make sense that y'all work a little bit more independently? Because if you're in those sprint ceremonies, and again, I see a lot of clients trying to be super helpful and they want to go to the retros and they want to go to daily stand-up. Well, if you're not providing information in the daily stand-up, you don't need to be there. Like, you might have team members underneath you that go to the daily stand-up. But again, it really depends on your role. If you are the client product manager, then you should be in all the agile ceremonies. That's just how it works. Obviously, the things I'm saying are very development focused because that is where people spend a lot of money on engagements with vendors. But depending on what they're doing, just make sure that you guys sit down, you know all the meetings that you need to be in and where to support and where your team needs to support. But it definitely gets a lot trickier when they're doing development because there's just a lot lot more activity and a lot more people involved and a lot more opportunity to go astray. So whatever that looks like for y'all, that's fine. Now, I have been in situations where we will do a separate daily, like there's so much going on, like if it's a very large program, we'll have a leadership stand-up, and then each of the dev teams will have dev team stand-ups, because there's so much happening with the client that the leadership is having to make daily decisions. And so in that stand-up, we would have the client directors, and we would have the client sponsor, anybody in a product management role, and anybody who's like in that chief architect role, making those daily decisions together with the program manager, and then the program manager is on the hook for cascading those decisions to the various teams within the program. So again, depending on the size and scale of what you're doing, just think about it this way, the meetings scale up as well. And there's just more to do, and make sure that you're involved appropriately. And then part of what you're doing in the one-on-ones is also checking in with your partner and your peer and making sure, am I supporting appropriately? Do you guys need anything from me? And then also giving them feedback on how they're doing. So I've talked about how it's important to establish that up front, but as you're managing throughout the engagement, you really need to be leaning on those one-on-ones for that kind of mutual feedback about how each of your teams are doing and where you're seeing things. And because you've had that line of communication opened up very early in this process, like we talked about setting it up from the beginning, hopefully you're then comfortable sharing your observations. And I would say that if you're a genuinely caring person, then you're going to notice things about the team, and you might be curious, like, oh, I've noticed so-and-so is gone a lot, or is something going on with so-and-so that haven't been the same. It's okay to ask questions like that. Just remember there is a boundary there. So if you're concerned, definitely, bring in your own human element, because we're all people. Just make sure you're not crossing the line where you're trying to manage their people. So if you're new to vendor management, or if you're a new manager, that's definitely something to be cognizant of. Is it's great to be invested in care and to connect with people on a human level, but the boundary you just need to watch out for is that you are not actually their manager. And that is something I've seen clients cross a few times, where they genuinely care about the people they're working with, but they need to make sure that they stay on the right side of that line and not interfere with the management or any HR processes. I'm just going to leave it at that with the vendor. And let me say again, I've seen that happen repeatedly. So just be very cognizant of that on your side. And again, if you as the client are ever curious about what that line is, have open conversations with that about the account manager and be like, is it okay for me to do this? If they don't seem like they're giving you a straight answer, then that's a no. And then also check in with your own boss and just be like, I'm very concerned about this and I've brought it up and I'm not sure how far to take it, and make sure you've got a game plan with your boss. That's also good to have the lines of communication open with your escalation point, which might be your boss, it might be a different internal executive. So make sure that whoever your escalation point is that you also have that regular check-in, one-on-one, that regular line of communication, so that they're kind of up to speed on what's going on. You're not pulling them in the day-to-day decisions, but you're giving them the key updates. But that means that they're prepared for if they do need to make a decision or they do need to step in. I'm going to say one more thing about the governance structure, which is that as the internal point of contact, you are responsible for socializing information, decisions, and bad news ahead of those governance meetings. I'm going to say that again. You are responsible for socializing decisions, bad news, and information ahead of those governance meetings. Depending on how big of a deal this project is, and depending on how big your company is and what level the project is playing at, you may have some pretty serious exposures. So most of the executive steering committees I'm on are with C-suites of Fortune 100 companies. So we're exposed to a lot of very serious executives who don't have a lot of time, function like very serious and senior executives function, which if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And they do not like to be surprised, and they don't like to get bad news in front of their peers, and they don't like to be embarrassed. And so keep that in mind, that you may work closely with these executives and be like, oh, that's just Fred. Sure, he's the CEO, but he's pretty chill. Not when this kind of stuff is on the line. I'm just going to say that. Or you might be in a position where you haven't interfaced with these executives much and you're kind of afraid to, and so you don't have the relationship where you're used to feeding them information on the side. Whatever situation you're in, the important thing to know is you need to be feeding them information on the side and preparing them ahead of steering committees. Sometimes that's a pre-read of the materials, and sometimes it starts before a pre-read of the materials. So a lot of times what will happen is that client sponsor goes to their boss and says, we're going to be giving some challenging news in this steering committee. Can we make sure the COO, the CEO, the CFO, whoever is involved, the chief digital officer, whoever it is, make sure that they're aware of this and get your boss's buy-in on how to do that. Because a lot of times you're not one level below these executive stakeholders. A lot of times you're a few levels below them. So make sure that your boss is aware and that you guys work on messaging together and that you know who is doing that messaging behind the scenes. So if you haven't done this before, or if you haven't been in such a high stakes situation, you may not be aware that that is what is happening. So I'm going to tell you, this is very important. And if you think people don't do this, it's just because you haven't been included in it before. But socializing things ahead of these meetings is actually what makes the meetings go well. And if you're listening to this video or watching this video and you are on the vendor side, make sure your clients are doing this. Because like I said, you might be like me where depending on the situation, you're wearing both hats at the same time or both hats separately. But make sure you are making sure your client is doing this. And I've had to do that even with clients who are very politically savvy. I will sometimes have to remind them, this is going to be a challenge, or this executive is not going to want to hear this in front of that executive, so should we have separate meetings and then bring them together? So make sure, whether you're in this situation as the client or the vendor, that you guys also work together on a game plan for how to effectively communicate this bad news or get this decision made. And when you do this well, even if things are problematic, your steering committees will still go well. Your decisions will get made easily because they're made before people walked into the meeting. If you don't do this well, this is when it hits the fan. And if you are the client in this situation, you will also get called out to the mat internally because you're responsible for managing this vendor. So this is probably one of the most serious things I'm going to say in this whole video, which is you need to be managing up very well when you are the person who's managing a vendor. Because at the end of the day, you're responsible for the vendor's misses. Only one time in my career have I seen someone who magically seems to never be held accountable for the things that their vendors do wrong. One time. 9 times out of 10, people get fired over stuff like this. So I don't mean to scare you, and you're going to say, Gabby, that's extreme. I've seen it happen a lot, to be honest. So it may sound extreme, but it's also very realistic. So you need to keep your nose clean as the person managing a vendor. You need to manage up very, very well. And people will think having a bad steerco is like the worst thing ever because people, I mean, I've seen executives yell, I've seen executives walk out of meetings, shut meetings down, refuse to meet with vendors ever again. And I've seen client sponsors get fired over and over and over again. There's usually an escalation that gets to that point. But what I'm saying is that if you manage up well, you will prevent all of those things from happening. If you don't, you're going to get fussed at. You're going to get embarrassed in meetings. Your vendor's going to be embarrassed in meetings. You're probably going to end up crying because I have. Even as the vendor, I've cried after terrible steering committee meetings. But just keep this in mind, is that at the end of the day, this could be a career killer for you, or it could be a career maker, and it all depends on how well you manage it and how well you manage up. Circling back to actually interacting with the vendor, one of the things that you need to do up front is make sure that the vendor understands your role and that they have the right expectations of your role. I've seen clients who move around in their organization, and sometimes with that movement and because of their style of management, the vendor gets the wrong impression of what they should be expecting from that client. So sometimes I've worked with clients who are highly involved and genuinely care about the team and are overly involved in lower level meetings, and then the vendor starts treating them like a lower level leader than they are. So I'm not saying you need to establish who's boss or anything like that. I'm saying you need to make sure that your vendor has appropriate expectations of your participation and your role and how much decision-making authority you do and do not have. Because I've also seen it go the other way, where the vendor is treating their day-to-day contact as if they're the executive decision maker and not the daily decision maker, and that sets them up for failure. I've seen that happen, and then the vendor gets really upset if their day-to-day decision maker gets overruled or a decision has to change because of something coming down from an executive. So just make sure that they understand the scope of your decision-making authority and the level at which you will be participating. So that upfront conversation about what meetings you're in is super important. And then in the kickoff, make sure that as you're discussing everybody's roles and responsibilities and the level of participation, that you're making it clear both internally and with the vendor what your role and your level of participation is. Because correcting that after the fact is actually super, super difficult. And you just don't want to start off wrong. You want to start off the way you're going to proceed. I've also seen people, and I've frankly made this mistake myself, where in the beginning I'm very engaged and caring and people get a certain sense of me, but then when we're really in the thick of things, I'm a very different leader and people tend to get thrown off by that. So just make sure to just be upfront about your leadership style as well, and just make sure people know, like, I can be demanding about deadlines, I'm very focused on efficiency, I care about time management, because I've been given feedback, for example, that I come off as very bubbly when people first meet me and very friendly. That is not who I normally am as a leader or when we're having serious conversations. When we have serious conversations, I'm very serious. So it can be very off-putting. So all I'm saying is make sure people know what to expect from you and then live and stand by that. And again, in that kickoff, you want to make sure that you and the project team have a mutual understanding of all expectations and working agreements. So all the stuff we talked about knowing which meetings you're going to be in and which meetings the team is going to have, all of that should be decided going into the kickoff, and it should be communicated in the kickoff. What that means is before the kickoff, you need to have some meetings with the project team about those expectations and about those working agreements. They'll have more conversations about their internal working agreements because they'll be working more together than you will with them. That's okay. Don't get your feelings hurt if they have some of those meetings without you, because again, you need to be functioning at the level you're at and not at the level you used to be if you're newly in your role, or if you love doing project work but you're in more of a leadership role now. You need to give them a little bit of space, and don't get your feelings hurt if you're not included in things. I say that because I do have some clients who want to be included in everything, and it's just not appropriate, to be honest. And even as a vendor leader, there's things where my team might have a happy hour that I'm not invited to, and that's okay, because at my level, I'm going to change the vibe of what they're doing, and they need to be able to be free to express themselves. So just really think about that, about the working agreements and what level you have of working agreements, and just be aware that they should have more detailed working agreements with the actual hands-on project team. The other thing you need to do is make sure you are prepared to make timely decisions. So whatever you're calling your role, whatever the vendor's calling your role, you guys have already worked through your working agreements and your expectations. So what I'm telling you is, in some ways, you are a decision maker in this project, and you need to make those decisions in a timely fashion, and you need to take this responsibility very seriously. If you are faced with a decision that is beyond your decision-making authority, it is your responsibility to facilitate that decision being made internally in a timely fashion. And again, I'm going to go back to contracts really quick. One of my favorite things to do in a contract is to put an SLA around decision-making, and it's usually 3 days. So if you don't have that in your contract, that's fine, but definitely really think about how long it should take to make a decision to keep the project team moving forward. Now, depending on how big the decision is, sometimes those genuinely do take more time. Some you can make a decision right then. So just be very mindful, though, that the decision is being made in a timely fashion and that you and the vendor are on the same page about how much time that's going to take. So again, I normally say 3 days for most project decisions, unless it's like massive and has to wait a week for a steer co. So just use that as your rubric, but also make sure that you constantly discuss that with the vendor. If they're like, we need this, make sure you're on the same page of, okay, I can get that decision to you by Friday. Does that work, or do you need it before Friday? So I always do the 3-day thing, because I don't think every decision should have to have that conversation, because in the first month of the project, honestly, you could be making 50 decisions a day and you should make them really, really, really fast. But if you think about it, every delay in you making a decision is a delay in them doing something they need to do, and you're just pushing that date out or you're just creating more and more pressure for the vendor. So your job is to make sure they're successful so that you can be successful. So timely decisions are key, and then communicating about decision timelines. I'll get back to you tomorrow. I'll get back to you on Friday. This is going to have to wait for steer co. What's the impact of that? So always be discussing timelines around decisions if you cannot make it the same day, and ask what the impact of a delay in that decision will be so that you're informed. And in an ideal world, your vendor should be telling you that every time they come to you for a decision. I need this decision today, I need this decision by Friday, or if you don't make this decision, this one's gonna happen. Unfortunately, I'm just gonna be really, really honest, it is only exceptional project teams that communicate at that level. That's unfortunate. I think any consulting company you pay, you should expect every team, every project team to function at that level of communication and quality. And I say this again as a consultant, unfortunately, most of them do not and have to be pushed to do it. That's just reality. So you as the client need to make sure that you're doing your part to encourage them to set those deadlines and to ask them about deadlines, because again, you would expect that if it's urgent, they'll tell you. They often won't. You'll expect that if it's urgent, they'll follow up with you. A lot of times they don't. They don't want to be a nag. They don't want to hurt the relationship. Unfortunately, a lot of times people in these roles on project teams are much more junior than they should be, and they're just not experienced pushing someone at your level or pushing a client of any level for a decision. So just be aware that you need to stay on top of these decisions. Now, if the project team is consistently not communicating with you, of course, that's feedback for their account team, and that's something they can grow. But even if you give that feedback, they're not going to change that overnight. And so just be aware of your own responsibility when it comes to timely decisions and your own ability to co-manage and truly partner with that vendor. Because when you're working with a vendor, it is genuinely a partnership and there is some give and take. They are not going to be perfect. You are not going to be perfect. You guys have to give each other grace in that partnership for the fact that you're all human. And one of the things that's consistently true is that even if you do all of that amazing setup I talked about, you can kill momentum and kill progress if you do not make timely decisions. So when I've had to come in and do project rescues, I will say 9 times out of 10, that is what the vendor team is complaining about, is that their client did not give them information they needed in a timely fashion or make a decision in a timely fashion. And when I'm doing the project rescue, I do usually fuss at the consulting team that they did not escalate that appropriately, communicate deadlines appropriately. Yes, I'm just saying I see this so much that I do have to say that as the client, you need to be cognizant of your role in that. All right, let's talk about documentation. So just like in the prep and the vendor selection process, documentation was important. During implementation, documentation is as much, if not more. Make sure that your vendor is documenting all of the requirements, everything that they need to be doing. They've got that in documentation. That documentation should exist not just in Jira. Most vendors are tempted to just say, it's in Jira, it's in a story. No, they should have an actual comprehensive requirements document in Confluence, in a Word document, whatever tool you guys are using, but make sure that it's not just in Jira. Same thing goes for decisions. You need to actually have a decision log. And again, your vendor is going to be tempted to be like, oh no, you sent that in an email and we put it in Jira. Whew. Again, I've done a lot of project rescues. I've had a lot of steer co's, and 9 times out of 10, you are having to go back and look for decisions. And it's so much easier if you have a comprehensive decision log, ideally with a link to when that decision was made. It was in a meeting, that meeting's recorded, it was sent in the meeting notes, etc. Side note, make sure that you and or the vendor are sending meeting notes, preferably the vendor, but make sure those notes are sent. I've seen a lot of teams get really lackadaisical about sending meeting notes, and then reconstructing things after the fact or later in the project is almost impossible. So meeting notes, Confluence or some similar comprehensive documentation, and a meeting log that's in an Excel spreadsheet or again in a Confluence table, wherever it is, but not just Jira. Jira is great for driving things. It is horrible for auditing decisions and justifying things to a steering committee. I also have to say one of the most amusing things I've ever seen is when project teams get asked for documentation and they think that the CEO who is asking for that documentation should be logging into Jira and reading their developer stories. That's crazy. That is not going to happen. So again, as the vendor manager, one of the things you're holding the vendor accountable for is their documentation. You need to make sure that they are documenting everything. You, depending on your level, do not necessarily need to be the person documenting the decision. However, if you are named as a product manager, make sure you know what you're documenting versus what they're documenting, because I've seen ambiguity there. But most of the time, the people I'm talking to, have bigger role than that, and so you're not on the hook for a lot of that documentation, but you are on the hook for making sure they do it. So something that's implied in there, but that I'm going to call out, is make sure all decisions are in writing. So even if you made the decision in the meeting, again, it goes in the meeting notes and it goes in the decision log, but even the decision log should have something that's in writing to get back to. If someone calls me for a decision, for example, I might be the decision maker and then someone's calling me on the phone, like in the evening or in the afternoon, and then I make the decision, I still want that documented. Even though I made it verbally, I want them to send me an email back saying, Gabby, thank you for making this decision when I called you. It doesn't have to be accusatory or overly formal. It just has to be in writing. Okay, a few more things about your role in managing the vendor during the implementation phase. And this is going to be hard because people start off strong and then lose momentum as they go. Again, it's human nature. Make sure you're attending the status meetings throughout the whole project. So just because it's going well doesn't mean you get to stop going. I see this happening so much where things are clicking right along, the teams hit the ground running, the team feels like they're part of the company now, and then it's easy to be like, okay, great, I can start, I don't have to keep attending these meetings. And I do see that happen. I'm saying this from experience, so keep in mind it is human nature, but you can't do it. You need to attend every status meeting. You need to listen very, very closely. You have to pay attention in the status meeting. I see a lot of clients multitasking in status meetings and they miss a lot of really important information, and then later they say, I didn't know this, I didn't know that. Now, if I'm involved in the project, I will normally be monitoring for that, and I will ask the project manager to pause and say the client's name, so-and-so. I want to make sure that we cover this part with you. And, there's a nice way to call out clients. But this video is for the client doing the vendor management, so I'm going to tell you, pay attention in status meetings. I see a lot of client sponsors checking on status meetings, and let me just say, again, I'm going to repeat this, they miss a lot of key information and then later say, I didn't know this, I didn't know that, and they feel very caught out. That information has been given to them. And I'm not saying that snarkily because I'm on the side of the vendor in this situation. I'm saying, hey, that can be frustrating for you, the client, but it is really frustrating for the project team when they are going through and doing all this work and they're saying it to their client sponsor and they can see the sponsors checked out. And it is also a tough feeling on the side of the project team when they feel like they're being accused later of not having said something. I will say a lot of times teams say things too casually, or the impact of what they're saying isn't communicated at the time. And so part of why you need to not just listen, but listen closely is you need to ask probing questions in these status meetings. Even if you're in a lot of the other project meetings and you feel like you know what's going on with the project, sometimes people will say something in a status meeting and you're like, wait a second, what's the impact of that? Or is that going to cost us some time? Or, oh, I knew we were waiting on this, but I didn't realize we were blocked. So actively participate in the status meetings. Ask, oh, is that blocking you? Is that causing a delay? This is especially important because a lot of times project teams think that this is obvious. So one of the reasons project teams don't communicate the impact of something they're telling you is they are so entrenched in the project that the impact is obvious to them. So they think it's obvious to you, and it isn't. It isn't obvious to anybody who's not that entrenched in what's happening at the super in the weeds level. So what I've experienced both as a client and as a leader who leads a lot of implementation teams is I'll be like, why did you not say that. And they'll be like, oh, everybody knew this. And I'm like, no, the whole point of the status meeting is you're telling the client things in a way that they know what to do with it and can make decisions on. So if you happen to be in a situation where you're leading project teams, please make sure your project managers and leads are communicating the impact of anything. And then if you're on the client side, make sure you're actively listening. You ask a lot of questions and you ask about risk and impact. Even if you just ask the same questions over and over again, if you hear something, be like, oh, what's the risk of that? Oh, well, what could happen? What's the impact of that? You may feel a little silly, but it is going to surface information that otherwise you would not know. Now, if their project manager is like top tier, top 1%, all this stuff is lined out in the risks and issues log. Hopefully your project status template has this information in there where there's like risks and impact and everything. But I'm telling you, that's like top 1% project manager behavior. The majority of project managers are not doing that. I don't know why it's so hard, but it is something that they struggle with, and they don't actually know they struggle with it a lot of times as well. So as the client, since you're responsible for this outcome and you're responsible for managing this vendor, you need to make sure that you're supporting this project team, supporting this vendor, and frankly, protecting your own company by asking probing questions in the status meeting. If you aren't, you're not doing your job. I'm just going to say it bluntly. So consider this part of your role in managing this vendor. And if you are the client project sponsor, if you are the client product manager, if you are the client project manager, or even if you're the client lead architect, this is part of your role in engaging with this vendor, is to be asking them these probing questions. I'm just going to double down on this part too, which is to make sure that every week you know what the risks and blockers are. So if your leadership came to you and said, what are the top 3 risks, or what's blocking the team, or what's the team worried about, you should be able to say that. And if you can't, that means that you're not having the right conversations with the team. You shouldn't always know that by observation. You should know that because you're having the right conversations with the project team in the status meetings or in your one-on-ones. So make sure that that's your own way of checking yourself every week, is saying, if an executive came to me and asked me this question, could I answer it? And if not, something's wrong. Okay, one of your other key responsibilities is to escalate internally. And you need to do that in an effective way. So just like we talked about before steering committee, socializing things before steering committee, the other thing you need to do is, before you even get to that point, if the team does have any risks or blockers, socialize that with your own boss. Make sure that they know, because this stuff can get very political, because a lot of times that's because an internal team is failing to do something. So I've worked with all different sizes of client organizations, and the bigger they are, the more they struggle with getting things done. And a lot of times it's because their internal teams turn into huge blockers, not intentionally, but it happens. And make sure that you have good relationships with the other leaders in your company and with these other teams that you're working with. So just like you have the open lines of communication with the vendor and upwards with your executive steerco, you want to make sure you have open lines of communication with any of the teams that you need to work with, whether that's technical teams, deployment teams, business teams who are providing requirements. The more teams you work with, the more opportunities you have for your project to get totally effed, because these people aren't doing what they need to do. So you need to support your project and your vendor by escalating internally and having good relationships with the other leaders. Escalating isn't always a negative thing. Sometimes it's calling up your peer on another team and being like, hey, I'm not sure that your team has had enough time freed up for this, or hey, I don't know if you know, but this key resource is out and we need somebody to come in and give access to this or provide this information, whatever it is. But you need to be doing your job supporting the project by having these conversations, and this is still escalating internally. Even if it's just that casual phone call, you're still handling it. You're helping to manage, you're helping to remove blockers, because as the client sponsor of this project, that is part of your role, is to remove blockers and issues from the project team that the vendor has. And they need to do their part by asking for things in a timely fashion and by communicating with this team that they're working with. but your job is to be an escalation point. So make sure that you're hearing these escalations from the vendor and that you're doing your part to help manage them. All right, those are the key tips for engaging and managing with your vendor. Now we're going to talk about some vendor red flags. I've alluded to some of these in previous sections, but I'm going to summarize all of them here and also give you some new ones. The first red flag from a vendor is that they never show their work. If they are not showing you that they have created these specific documentations or these deliverables, that's a problem. If they are not showing you something they've developed, that's a problem. Whatever their work is for you, if they're not collaborating with you on that work and they never want to show it to you, that's not going to work. I also talked about having highly collaborative relationships with your vendor. So one of the key things about working with your vendor is if they're creating content or images for you, for example, and they like to go off in a vacuum for 3 weeks and then show you something and then you give them feedback and they go off for another 2 weeks, that's just extending your timeline, to be honest. So even if you don't come from a highly collaborative environment, when it comes to the work they're doing, you do need them to be showing it to you frequently and often. And if they're not showing it to you at all, or there's these long gaps, something's wrong, and that's a red flag, not just in working style, but frankly in their ability to effectively do what you're hiring them to do. The second red flag is if they never communicate issues. All project teams and all vendors have issues. It is totally normal. If you've done everything you can to make a safe space for them to discuss their issues and they're still not raising issues to you, that's a red flag either about their communication style or about the severity of the issues they're having. So a lot of times if vendors are going quiet about their issues, it's because their issues are of such a magnitude, they're trying to fix it before you know about it because they think you'll be horrified by it. That might be true, it might not be true, but they're not allowing you to partner with them and solution with them if they're not discussing those issues with you. Also, I'm just going to say this again, sometimes the issues are so catastrophic that the longer they go without telling you about the issue, the more that actually snowballs and will cost you even more money down the line. So if you right away notice that you're in the engage phase or if you're in the deliver part and they are not discussing issues with you, you need to push them and you need to open up those lines of communication. And if you're trying to do that with your peer and that is still not happening, you need to give feedback about it. And you also need to engage your escalation point to escalate with them, because every project has issues, and if they hide the little ones, what are they going to do when they're big ones? Another red flag is if they are not elevating decisions to you. So we talked about your role as a decision maker, and if you're sitting there going, man, my vendor never asks me for decisions. Well, that is a problem. That is a huge red flag. That means they're either floundering or they're making assumptions on their side that they should not be making. Open up conversations with them if they're not running decisions by you and get them to be more open and collaborate with you. If that doesn't work, again, that is an escalation with their executive leadership, because that is a huge red flag and a sign most of the time that they are making assumptions and that those assumptions aren't going to be right. I see this happen more with very junior teams or with very small and kind of more junior vendors. So they may not even know that that's a problem. So I wouldn't go in guns a-blazing, but I would, again, first try and open up the conversations with the team and see what surfaces, make yourself more available. Talk to your escalation point if that's not working, and then use your leadership and the higher level escalation point just to make sure that things aren't going wrong. That can be a tough conversation, but it's better to have it early, because I'm telling you, this isn't going to get anywhere good if they're not discussing those decisions with you. Another red flag is if in the beginning of the project and coming out of the sales cycle, they don't have a roadmap for their work. And then if you're in the first month of the project and they're not producing a project plan, that is another huge red flag. I know a lot of people, once Agile started feeling like, well, project plans were out the door, and as long as you've got sprints, that's great. But you should at least have a roadmap of saying what's in the sprints. And when you're doing business with more than one company, a project plan is even more essential, because there's a lot of supporting activities that have to go on between teams, and you need to know when those activities are happening. So if you're engaging with a vendor and they're of the we don't need project plans type, that's not going to work very well, especially if your company, like the bigger it is and the more complex it is, the more dependencies you have on opening up firewall changes, or frankly, even having predictability about when decisions need to be made. There has to be a schedule of some kind. If they don't know that, that is a problem in how they deliver, that they don't even know that that's important. That's concerning. And if they can't produce a project plan, that's a different issue. I've worked with a lot of project managers who for some reason struggle to make project plans. So that could be an issue not with the vendor you're working with, but with their project manager as like an individual issue. Definitely escalate it early. you should have a specific date by when you should be getting a project plan from that project manager. You have to do your due diligence and your governance over that vendor by making sure that they produce these deliverables, even if you're not as involved in the day-to-day, so the schedule itself doesn't matter as much to you. You still need to make sure that they have one. And depending on your level, the things that happen in that schedule might actively impact you. And you can't help coordinate internally if you're not aware of specific dates. So again, red flags if there's no roadmap and then there's no project plan. Another red flag is if they don't have a risk log or don't know what one is. That is standard. So if they don't do that, that is concerning. And again, depending on how big your project is, that's going to be more important. If you're doing a 4-week engagement with 2 people, do I think a risk log is as important if you're not spending a ton of money on it? No. But most projects and most vendor relationships we're talking about are bigger and longer than that. So yes, they need to have a risk log. Another red flag is if they disappear or go quiet, something is wrong. I always used to say this in these massive go lives I used to run too, and we'd have like 50 people on these go live calls. If people stopped giving updates or went quiet, something was wrong and they were trying to fix it before anybody else freaked out. But open communication is key. If your vendor is disappearing or going quiet, yeah, no, that's not going to end up anywhere good. So definitely nip that in the bud. If they miss commitments early on, huge red flag. That means that they are signed up for things that they can't deliver, or they don't take commitments or communication seriously. It's one of those. So keep an eye on that. That's one of the best ways to build trust, is to make a commitment and keep a commitment. And so you should be concerned about your ability to trust them if they are not doing that. Related, another red flag is if they're not even making commitments. So if they're not even telling you, I'll send this to you on Friday. If they don't give you dates for things, that's a concern. This is a little different than the project plan, because this is like sometimes at a lower and more granular level. But similarly, if they don't make commitments on when that they're going to do something or when they're going to do it by, that's a bit of a red flag, because how can they hit an end date? Another red flag is if they have a lot of turnover. I've seen this happen with vendors where they have a lot of turnover of project team members, and that is usually indicative of poor management on their side in one way or another. And in some cases, it has actually been a sign that that company or that division is imploding in some way. So keep an eye out for if you're having to replace a lot of team members. Something is wrong somewhere. That is a big risk. Another red flag is if there's a lot of churn. Do they tend to churn on decisions? If you've made a decision and they're still chewing on it, they're still pushing back on it, or you've given them requirements and they keep talking and talking and talking about it. If you're just seeing a lot of churn in some way with the project team, they're not moving forward, and you should be concerned about that. It also means that they may not have the right skill sets in place, whether that's at a leadership level or at a contributor level, but churn is a red flag of something. So dig into that if you're seeing a lot of churn, or at least give feedback that you're concerned that you're going to lose forward momentum because of the churn. I see what happening a lot of times is that clients get involved in the churn. Sometimes they contribute to the churn, sometimes they're part of the churn, but as the client sponsor, you need to be able to take that step back and step up and look across what you're doing and understand how much impact churn can have, recognize when you and or they are in churn, and be able to put a stop to it. And then my final red flag for a vendor is if they don't seem to understand you or care about what you're trying to do and why. They can't genuinely be a partner and help you be successful in your company's mission if they don't care why it's happening. Sometimes I've seen clients get concerned that the project team doesn't seem to care. And every time they've been right. Something has been wrong with the vendor team in some way, whether again, it's not the right resources or they're struggling, but if they don't seem to care, something is definitely wrong. They might care and they might just be having issues that make them look that way. So what you're seeing and what's wrong may not be the same thing, but it's that observation that they don't seem to care, that's an issue. Or if you feel like they just don't get you, yeah, I've seen that too with clients and with some consultants where the client's like, yeah, I don't think they get what we're doing or what we're asking. Every single time they have been correct. And when I've been on the vendor side, I've had to smooth that over, but correct it in some way. But I've also seen a lot of vendor leaders kind of sweep that under the rug, and don't let that get swept under the rug. If you think that the person you're working with doesn't get you, they don't. and they're not going to. And they can't deliver the best results for you if they don't. All right, now we're going to get into the pro tips for you. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, so if you have any questions and want me to spend more time on one or more of these, please let me know in the comments and I can either respond in the comments or make more videos. All right, the first one is to hold them accountable for their commitments early on and consistently. Hold them accountable in the status meetings before you escalate. Give them an opportunity to correct it. Don't be the person that escalates before you actually help them solve the problem. So hold them accountable, do it in status meetings, and make sure that you've done the right things before you escalate. Number 2, create a safe space for you guys to discuss issues and problems together. You create that safe space and then you're an active participant in solving the problem. Number 3, keep the lines of communication open at all levels. Number 4, be a true collaborative partner. Number 5, you've heard me say this before, make decisions in a timely fashion. Number 6, if you have concerns, keep your leadership and theirs informed so that no one is surprised if you have to escalate. Number 7 is related. Be clear when you are informing versus escalating. You don't want to start a fire drill when a fire drill is not necessary. Conversely, you don't want to be trying to start a fire drill and someone thinks you're just letting them know. Number 8, document everything, including your concerns, but don't be icky about it. Number 9, don't bicker. Don't get drawn into arguments. It is a partnership and it's great to be friendly, but you still need to maintain an authoritative role because you are the client. So you do need a little bit of distance there. And unfortunately, bickering, arguing, and going back and forth diminishes that. Number 10, stay informed, but do not micromanage them. You are paying them to manage this work. That is not your role. Your role is to provide information, to facilitate their success, and to provide oversight over the vendor and to manage them and be a partner, but you are not supposed to be managing their work for them. Number 11, if it gets contentious, take a step back and try to see the big picture. Remember why you're there and make sure that you have a fair and just perspective on what's happening. Number 12, remember that there will be ups and downs on this project and there will be give and take in the relationship. As long as both sides are actively problem solving together and both sides are making concessions when needed, you can work most problems out. There are always gives and gets, but those gives and gets need to be on both sides. And finally, number 13, make sure that you are aligned to the contract and that you stay aligned to the contract. But don't be a jerk about it. All right, I hope that you enjoyed our video on vendor management. I know that it was a long one. If you have any questions about anything we've talked about in this video, please leave a comment and let me know if you'd like to hear more about it or if it's something you just want me to answer in the comments. This was a fun one. Good luck out there. Thanks, y'all.